I'm David Pinsoff.
I am David Pietrzewski, although I go by
And this,
Dave on the podcast because
yeah,
it's
he's
confusing.
Dave. I'm David.
Yeah,
And this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast.
in parentheses,
In
yes.
parentheses,
And this is
welcome.
actual evolutionary psychology by actual
Yes.
evolutionary psychologists.
Forgot the tagline. I'm sorry, Dave.
That's okay. I mean, who listens to this podcast anyway?
Yeah, it's true.
So
All right.
I hope you, listener, are one of those people. Thank you for being one of those people. Um, And, in defense of David, he has already heard the episode by the time it comes out. So, but David, you
Yeah.
should be listening. David, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Dave.
Today we have a very special and kind of different episode, and this is Brenda Bowser. Brenda Bowser is at Cal State Fullerton. She's professor of anthropology, and this episode was sort of born out of, we were celebrating the life of John Patton, who very unfortunately passed away, and I attended, there was a symposium last October to sort of talk about all of the things that John Patton did in his career. And today we're very lucky to have his wife and lifelong collaborator, Brenda Bowser, really just talking about their field site, Canombo, and sort of just, I don't know about you, David, but if there's one episode we've ever recorded that what has been said has sort of stuck in my memory, this is that one.
Yeah, this one was pretty haunting. We should give a disclaimer for listeners. We get into intergroup violence, abduction of women, really heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So maybe not bedtime listening.
No, but deeply sincere experiences from Brenda and from the field about their time in Canombo. And yeah, I don't know. I think, like David said, I think I think there was a different feel to this episode.
Mhm.
And we really appreciated Brenda coming on and talking about her time with John. And I think, I we'll link to the John Patton Memorial Symposium content. There were so many amazing scientists who worked with him, and yeah, I think this is just part of sort of celebrating and thinking about his contribution to science. And if there were any justice in the world, John Q. Patton, would be very widely known in terms of the anthropology and evolutionary psychology of intergroup conflict. And every time I ever saw him at, for example, the HBS meeting, it was always sort of like, I just felt so lucky to spend time with him, and he would tell me stories from the field in a place where there was actually group conflict. And as a experimental lab psychologist, it sort of kept me honest.
Mhm. Yeah, this was a really special episode, and I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay, without further ado, here is Brenda Bowser. Welcome, everybody. We have another wonderful guest today. Today we have Brenda Bowser. Brenda, obviously, we miss John a lot, and I know you and John really spent a tremendous amount of your life in doing this field site in Canombo. And I almost feel sort of silly asking you a question about it to start off with. And I know you've been thinking about sort of reflecting on this lifetime of sort of doing this thing. For those of the people listening who don't know what you've been doing, what would you like to start out by saying about? Yeah.
Why I did a timeline and I won't go through the whole thing and I barely got through the beginning of it, but
Mm,
John and I met as PhD students at
mm,
UCSB, um, and we met in 1983. And by 1985. We had gotten together, so to speak, and decided that we would do this field work together. And we were married in 87. We planned literally our first child around our field work. Luckily, we had a friend who was a PhD student in anthropology and decided to go to medical school. And so she counseled us on how to plan to have a child in the field and all the weights and ages and immunizations and how to figure all that out. So we did that. And John went to, this is a shortened version, of course, but went to New Guinea when Neil was 11 months old, I mentioned. So that was 89, and then came back and had been applying for funding, but the New Guinea folks who were reviewing NSF proposals at the time were not particularly enamored by Darwinian approaches. So Chagnon approached John and said, you should come to Yanomamo territory with me, which we planned to do. And then there was a military coup. And John got a note, a handwritten note from Chagnon in his box saying, can't go. There's been a military coup. The president's mistress is responsible for the permit. She's fled the country. We don't have military permits. By then,
Wow.
John and I had given up our place to live. I had taken a leave of absence from my job, and we had to rethink where we were going to go. And this was really foremost for John's dissertation work at the time. And from there, really, it starts the search for Konambo and how.
Amazing. Yeah. And just to like fill in some of the details for folks. So John is interested in human conflict. Is this the overarching theme and why he goes to New Guinea?
John was interested in, I'm trying to think of how to put it succinctly. I mean, certainly human warfare and the evolved psychology of coalitional violence, but particularly as that relates to men's status and the question of why men kill, why men engage in warfare, how, from a Darwinian perspective, one can explain that conundrum of altruism. And that was sort of the root of John's question, but always seated in evolutionary thinking. And he studied biology first at USC. So he really came to anthropology and to UCSB with an evolutionary perspective, and particularly grounded in ecology and behavioral ecology. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, his dissertation, was titled Thoughtful Warriors, and I think one of the things that was implicit in sort of what I was looking for, and one of the things that I just love talking to John so much when I would talk to him about at like the Human Behavior and Evolution Society conference or reading his dissertation was the Thoughtful Warriors was that this thing of conflict or killing or being a warrior, which I think sometimes gets romanticized or demonized, either way. John was looking at it from this perspective of we have to just respect that it might be complicated and there's a logic to it. And it was neither gratuitously anti or pro. It was just sort of dispassionately like this is going to be a complicated psychology.
right.
But you mentioned he went to New Guinea 11 months. I can't imagine that. And am I correct in understanding that where he went and even Kanabo itself, which we'll get into in a second, it's not not only is it not, a four-star hotel. I mean, on some level, you're going to a place because of human conflict being
Right.
Mm.
in the air. So these are not necessarily the safest places. Is that right? And sort of how can can you elaborate a bit on that? And was that part of, yeah, because I
I
can imagine
can.
people listening and saying, well, what do you do? Yeah, it's a really yeah, I'll shut up and let you say.
No, I guess I want to kind of free list here a little bit of the thinking and the
Yeah.
thinkers who influenced John's the development of his research question, and which then led to the choice of field sites. And so certainly Robert Wright and the Moral Animal, Alexander Hamilton on kin selection, Chagnon's work, Trivers on reciprocal altruism, Franz de Waal on chimpanzee politics, and especially triadic awareness as the foundation of coalitional thinking, building
Mhm.
from there, right? From those dyadic comparisons, then a triadic comparison, and to build really a construction of cognitive categories that are coalitions
Mm.
and understanding status within that context, so not disembedded in any way. So there were specific criteria for selecting a field site. The first one, which I think is generally the advice that most of us give all of our students, right, is your choice of field site should be driven by your research question.
Mm.
So for John, the first thing was a history of recent or ongoing tribal conflict. So coalitional violence, which is the definition of warfare that John was working with. So, so the research question really was the first criterion for selecting a place to go, and New Guinea was a great place to go and do that because of the ongoing and long-standing history of tribal warfare. So that was why he went to New Guinea and wanted to do that. So I think that answers that.
Yeah. What
that.
was that like? I mean, did you guys have a I mean, if you don't want to answer, but what, he has an 11-month-old and then he's going to the fields. What was that discussion like? I mean,
You know, he went for 1 month, and the idea was he would go and check it out and then come back, and we could continue to work on getting funding and know what it would be like and plan better. So, but for me, I was trained as an anthropologist.
mm,
So I was trained and I was in the archaeology program, but I wanted to look at really the material correlates of status and alliance, and particularly with a focus on women. And John and I always joked that before we started to do this work, we divided the world into the living and the dead, and he did the living and I did the dead. And then once we started this work, we divided the world along gender lines, and he
mm,
worked, mainly with the men, and I worked mainly with the women. So we were, and we often said that, it may have seemed brave for us to do that, but if anything bad had happened, and things bad do happen in the field, especially with children, sometimes
mm,
people lose their children in the field. Sometimes there are books written on children in the field. There are a lot of challenges. So we would have just seemed really stupid if anything
yeah.
bad had happened. But we were really cautious and we took our time, and that was a piece of it. So like I said, we planned, we knew and we worked with our pediatrician, in fact, for Neil, to know what what health challenges we should plan for, how many pounds Neil would need to be before he could take the medications and the immunizations, and the same for us. We recognized an additional responsibility for keeping ourselves alive, so that we didn't leave a child. And we had to make plans for what would happen if something happened to us in the field. And that, of course, involved the support of the community and decisions about who would take responsibility for Neil if something happened to us. So
Yeah.
I think we we both felt fairly confident in our ability to work in the field. I'd done lots and lots and lots of archaeological work in the tropics and elsewhere, and for years doing, tough logistics. And John also was a really skilled outdoorsman. So we felt prepared, we felt confident. We had role models who were awesome, I mean, Chagnon, Brown,
Yeah, Napoleon
um,
Chagnon and yeah, Donald
right,
Brown. Yeah, Donald Brown.
right,
Yeah.
right. And, everyone in our world, including graduate students, like Barry Hewlett was a graduate student when we were at UCSB, all went off to do these awesome periods of fieldwork. And the expectation, the requirement at UCSB at the time was a minimum of 12 months.
Mm.
So we knew that this is what we were to do. And um, I'm, I'm, we just had a lot of support and a lot of good models and a lot of training and good advice. And we felt prepared.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think yeah, it's I think it's still brave.
I think so too. Looking back, we were not afraid, but not careless either.
Right, right. It wasn't reckless. Yeah.
No. So
David, if
I
you
mean,
I
I
think
mean,
yeah.
every time we bring on an anthropologist and they talk about the trials and tribulations they go through, I personally could not imagine being there. I am a coward. I'm a kvetcher. I could not handle being in that kind of situation. If it were me and I was choosing a research question, it would be the cultural semiotics of the Ritz-Carlton.
I'm
Uh,
less comfortable there than I am in Panama.
Yeah. And we'll get to Kanambo. Oh, yeah. So Kanambo, and I mean, one way to maybe introduce Kanambo, and maybe this is a cartoonish version, but for me, it was in reading John's dissertation, which is incredible. And we'll post a link to John's dissertation probably for this episode. Um, is I think this was like an earlier colonial explorer who sort of met with the kind of Ashwar community, but it was about this was a community that resisted not only was it Mayan and also Spanish? I mean, can you? And there's also an anecdote with molten gold. Is this the
That
yeah
was the Spanish. Yeah,
yeah? Can you
so
yeah?
the ethnohistory of the region is that the Shuar and Achuar territories in the sort of flanks of the eastern flanks of the Andes and down into the upper Amazonian watershed that is the Ecuadorian Amazon, that those folks successfully resisted the Inca incursion, which and there were others in Ecuador, especially because that was late in the empire expansion.
Mm,
The Inca, but they were repelled by the Achuar and the Shuar, and the Achuar and the Shuar also repelled initial Spanish incursions. And the story is that there's gold in the Shuar territory, which is up in the hills a little bit from where we are, but the story is that they poured molten gold down the throat of a Spanish, you know,
Yikes.
the
colonial
governor, yeah.
encourage. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
John would sort of
Brutal.
always during the CP. John Tooby would often sort of recount John Patton's story of it, or just sort of that the men just sort of surrounded this guy's hut or his building, and sort of was saying, you wanted this gold, here it is. Sort of, it was sort of revenge, almost like Hollywood style revenge, but a true story.
And Michael
Wow.
Hunter wrote about that in his ethnography on the Shuar, and I haven't actually tracked down those historical sources, so I don't
Mm,
know how well-founded they are.
okay. Yeah. So there's a yeah, but I mean, and I think John in the dissertation notes where he got that quote from. But yeah, it's quite striking. You don't always come across an academic dissertation with the introduction to the field site, including how they fended off the Incas and the Spanish, and there's this story of the them going and pouring molten gold down the throat of the person who was trying to sort of um, basically exploit the land and the community. So
And the Achuar still see themselves as fierce people.
mm,
And so I can tell you things that were said. Um, there was a one John, actually, I was staying in a community with Neil, and John was headed downriver in a small canoe where they said, Senora, it's too small for you, it's too dangerous. And I'm like, okay. So they went without me and I was sad. But the first place that they stayed, the traditional greeting from a person, an Achuar person in their house is you call up, hoot up to the houses, which are usually built high on river terraces and defensible locations traditionally. And the response, if you're welcome, is don't worry, I will not kill you while you sleep. So John got that response his first visit going
that's
down the river.
that's the good
I can't
news.
imagine
That's
that
the
was very
good.
reassuring. Oh, okay. Thanks
Well,
for
you need
telling
to
me.
know. I
Okay,
guess you need to know
I'll
that's the
sleep
good
easy now.
answer. That's the good
Yeah.
answer. You need to do your homework to know that's the good answer.
There was a story that you know, I think parts of, Dave, but there was a big fight among a bunch of senior men. It was not dignified, and it's a longer story, of course, about what they were fighting about and such. But one of the men who identifies as Quechua said, basically threatened to kill one of the Achuar men. And this was Isaac Pichura, and he stood up and he said, you cannot kill me. I am Achuar. I
Mm,
will kill you when you go outside to pee at night on the trail. And that's the standard way that raids are mounted, especially against individuals, when killing is targeted. So, and those threats are real. In this case, I think it was understood that this was going to be resolved, but without violence. But this was still anyway. So the threat of violence was there, and there were real situations and um, deaths while we were there, and certainly we heard firsthand accounts and were there for resolutions of some of those things and watched people's, I mean, conflict management strategies, which might just be that you hop out of the canoe and spend the night sleeping in the forest, while we went downriver with other people. But this one man couldn't go because it was his father who had killed the father of someone who was in that village, and there's still the obligation for retaliation. But people have strategies for dealing with that. And in this case, it was not to be confrontational, not to go into the community, just to get out of I mean, the canoe stopped and Simone Kuhi got out. And I was like, what's going on? And it took a while for people to explain because you're not sitting so close to people in a canoe always. But anyway, that was one of those things. So there were times when we were worried about our own safety. There were times when I was worried about my own safety if there were death threats against the person whose house I was staying at, for
mm.
example. And people would tell me, don't worry, Brenda, it would cause problems if someone killed you. No one will kill you. And I just
Wow, so
I,
reassuring.
Yes, the consequences after. Yeah,
well, it was still kind of nerve-wracking, but I, I learned a lot every time, and
yeah,
and I learned to trust people. So, and I trusted that people really watched out for me and watched out for John and watched out for our kids because we eventually had three of them, and they each came to the field at different times. Um, so I think and if we're talking about field sites and how to choose field sites and how to maintain field sites, which is one of the questions that you raised earlier, Dave, trusting, being able to trust, learning what you don't know, and being able to um, follow instructions, you know, that and respect the people who live there, that they have greater knowledge than you do. And it's not only a good way to live, period, but to live safely, but to live well within the community and to learn as much as you can possibly learn. So so listening to people is really
yeah.
important.
Amazing. We just got to Kanambo, so we were in New Guinea. Kanambo, I mean, there's sort of two questions. One is sort of what was the personal decision to go there? And then the second thing is that I think most people listening are thinking, well, this sounds like a very scary, violent place. Um, is is that something that the people there think of themselves as it being a scary and violent place, or is that something we're sort of painting on here? And do you know what I'm sort of getting
Yeah,
at? So yeah,
I
yeah.
do. So there is the the latent potential for violence, and that's always managed and always there. So there's a lot of time spent on consensus building,
Mhm.
addressing problems when they arise, identifying problems early. And that's really the day-to-day work of adults in the community, is to um, manage politics because of the potential for violence. But we went in, when I said it, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how we got into Conumbo, because it really did take a year. So anybody who thinks that you just pop in, it's not, it's a big time commitment. So, but Conumbo and those territories had a history of endemic raiding and into I figured this out from at one point because I've written it, but certainly past the 1960s, into the 1970s. And so the older people in the communities at the time had experienced this,
Had experience rating.
had experienced raiding, and I mean, literally, uh, you know, captive women,
Wow.
sisters who were still living in the communities where they had been taken when they were stolen during raids. I mean, those were discussions that evoked a lot of emotion. People who had killed, who would come to our house, at night. I can think of one guy, Visuli, who came to our house to tell us about the people he had killed. I think they were five. He knew, of course, exactly. And his children didn't know those stories.
Wow. Wow.
And when we went into communities, people would tell the stories that they knew, so it might be their mother who was a child who hid under the bodies of her cousins in a canoe, so that, and she wasn't killed, but, her cousins were. And um, so I think John and I were 34, I think, when we went into Conambo. And the men and women who had experienced these big raids, um, and active raiding, um, were married to women my age, so a little bit older.
Mm.
So and people referred to this. There was one senior person in the community of Conambo, not sorry, in Copatasa, actually on a different river, but where we went first. But he referred to it as the time when we were dying, and it was the time when community. I want to say community leaders, but they weren't community leaders yet. They were people who formed communities and then became community leaders because they invited others in, others joined them, but they really intentionally worked on conflict management and reconstructing um, society. And this was true in many parts of Amazonia, not
Mm.
just in the area where we were, but it took us a long time, I think, to realize how historically embedded those processes were throughout that enormous subcontinent.
Well,
Well, I suspect the question that is going through a lot of our listeners' mind, in addition to my mind, is why. So, whenever there is any kind of violence that takes place, we want to know why it happened. What were the causes? If we watch a true crime documentary, we want to know what's going on inside the killer's head. Why did he do it? What was the motive? And so the question that has been eating away at me as you've been describing these really terrifying scenarios with this ambient possibility of violence being a fact of life is why? Why? What do you think are the causes of these killings? Are there multiple causes? How do you partition them? What is your understanding here of what is behind this?
So, from a very reduced perspective, I would say, at the core of almost every story of violence is a conflict over women, and that certainly would have been John's first
mm.
response.
Hmm.
Um, but to understand that, um, it's really
Conflict over women. Could you unpack that for us? Because that is a pretty striking claim. And I know certainly conflicts over women. We know what we have some idea of what that's like. I mean,
yeah.
there's talk of incels these days, men who are involuntarily celibate and they're, sometimes they engage in violence. Um, what what does it mean for violence to be driven by conflict over women?
Well, to take kind of one level, um, captive women are, the women are stolen throughout the world even today, right?
Mhm.
And but I think to contextualize it more, um, again, thinking about small scale societies, places where there are no institutionalized positions or institutions that manage politics, it's the responsibility of every man and woman to make decisions. And there are still cultural institutions for who's responsible for responding to particular incidents. So partly the answer to your question is that there are long histories, there are long genealogies, there are responsibilities on the part of sons, especially to avenge the deaths of their fathers. So that's part of the context. But if
Mhm.
we're talking about conflict over women, um, in these and I'm going to speak now to Konambo and Achwar and Quechua and Zapata, which are the three indigenous ethno-linguistic groups represented in that territory, but it's a more general phenomenon. So So women are taken in raids, women are taken individually. And this is more historic that, but not only historic. To be taken, and I asked Napoleon Chagnon about this too, if it was true among the Yanomamo, and he says it is. So to be taken, for a woman to be taken can be considered true even if she leaves of her own volition, but without the permission of her father. So there
Hmm.
are many circumstances in which women run off with men, but there are also many historic circumstances where a young girl might be bathing by the river and a man from another river basin may observe her over time and then snatch her and run with her. There may be a retaliatory raid like the Hatfield and McCoy kind of thing where women are taken, and those require vengeance. Um, if a woman is married to a man, her father has the right to reclaim her, even when she's a grandmother. That right, he exists for his entire life. That threat to reclaim one's daughter can often serve to settle disputes at the time, put down the gun or I will take my daughter back. Um, but if he were to do that, that would cause problems, and the family of the daughter, the husband in this case, could rightfully and would have to make a decision about how they were going to respond. And they could respond by going in a raid to take her back. And that circumstance is true and documented, certainly in the oral histories that I've recorded in the territory where we work. So, and those are not forgotten. Those things are not forgotten. And a raid might include, physical assault of other people in the household. It might include killing of men in houses on the way upriver, downriver, along the trail. It just depends on the level of escalation. So, strategies to de escalate violence are part of this landscape as well. And people know how to do that, and they have to make decisions about how they're going to respond to circumstances that give them the right and the responsibility to respond, but they have other responsibilities as well, like maintaining peace. So these are all decisions that are made among people in coalitions, how they're going to respond, whether they're going to support violence, as a retaliation, as a response, or whether they aren't. Um, so those are, if that's, so there are many ways a woman can be stolen. And it can be, she can be taken back by her family. She can be stolen by a complete stranger. She can be, and that is more historic. But to be today, to be taken without permission of the father is the one of the more common affronts. And
So
and
if I'm hearing you correctly, if a woman voluntarily falls in love with someone in a different community and runs off with that person, the father will view this as literally equivalent to her being abducted
yeah,
forcefully by a neighboring community.
yeah. And I asked Napoleon Chagnon, who has, of course, recorded extensive histories and genealogies of this, and I asked him specifically whether the same linguistic term is used, and he said yes.
Mhm.
So there's no
Wow.
distinction.
Wow.
Mm.
I mean, to a Western mind, that is pretty mind-boggling. It seems like a huge chasm of a distinction there, and yet they're not make. So, what do you think is behind that? Why do they view them as equivalent?
So marriages throughout much of the world are still arranged, whether we think that or not. We're a peculiar society where we believe in marriage for love, which fails fairly often. But I, I think here it's important to realize the age of marriage and also some of the conventions of marriage. So there's sororal um, polygyny, so that a man who marries a woman may reasonably expect to also marry her sister. The sister may reasonably expect to run off with or marry her sister's husband and may want to, but the age of marriage, five would be unusual, but is not unheard of. And that's not considered right. That's a whole nother kind of adjudication. But for a young girl to be married at the age of 8, if her father is really old or really dead, then girls tend to be married earlier. Um, but the age of 8, the age of 11, and I've recorded the ages of marriage for a long time and going back in time. 13, any older than 13, you're kind of getting over the hill. So for a young woman to choose to run off, especially at that age, is not so uncommon. Um, you know, they're not always thinking well in those early adolescent years, no matter where we are. So um, there was there was one circumstance where a really senior guy who really had been a fierce warrior, which delighted John, of course, had 5 or 6 wives, but he was really old. And his older wives weren't kind to the younger wives, and he took on an additional wife, and she was really young. And and I don't even remember now, but she ran off with his son. And we'd only been in the community. This was a different community, but we'd only been there, maybe a couple of weeks. But we saw that drama unfold. And he threatened to go after them. He was going to kill both of them and with his gun. But what happens is that there's this sort of, on the trail, the word is passed, he's going to come after you. You'd better keep going, and they run further and further. And maybe after time that will be resolved, or maybe it won't. But she didn't want to be in that marriage. It was not a good marriage. And that's true for a number of women. But leaving a marriage is something that can cause so much conflict and retaliation and violence that people don't support it. So the women and men who run off have to run far. And that's true whether the woman is abducted just cold, by the river. The guy tends to go. Warren DeBoer did a study of the ethnography and found this to be a pattern. They tend to go 1 or 2 rivers over, so that they go far. And you can think of it as the conflict management strategy, where they leave town basically. But that's some of the context for, I mean, there are many contexts in which women are regarded as stolen, but those raids, when they were endemic, almost always involved taking women and really incorporating them violently into the community and the household.
Wow. I mean, there are so many questions I have here, but before I get into them, I just want to make sure that I'm getting the picture of what's going on here correctly. So it seems to me, based on what you're describing, that the centripetal force of these societies is violent competition between men. And what they are competing over is a limited resource, namely women. And that has a kind of cold, tragic Darwinian logic, which is that the men who succeed in capturing women will tend to have a reproductive advantage, and the genes promoting such behavior will therefore have a selective advantage relative to alternative genes. So this has a really awful Darwinian logic to it. And because these coalitions of men are competing with one another over this limited reproductive resource, the primary motive behind violence in these communities is either capturing women or avenging the capture of women or the killing of other men. So it's primarily capturing women or revenge. Is that a fair characterization, or am I oversimplifying?
No, I think that you are fair in your theoretical assessment
Hmm.
of the situation. It fits the facts on the ground. It fits the historical facts. It fits the genealogical facts, the ethnographic facts.
Hmm.
But I wouldn't say that that's the focus of life
Okay.
today, for sure.
Okay.
I think it's the focus of our theory
Hmm.
of the moment. But I think, and I've thought about this quite a bit because, I mean, that was the focus of the both John and I, you know, studied, collected data on alliance formation and how those relationships worked and how they were um, supported, what greased the wheels, how decisions were made, all of those things. But it's still, I think, and even in other parts of Amazonia, as I've been privileged to work with scholars elsewhere, I've spent a fair amount of time in Brazil now with anthropologists there and some in a little bit in the communities. But um, I think we need to turn this narrative on its head,
Hmm.
which is that when things got heated in Conambo, it would not be unusual for, especially one woman in particular, who was one of my main instructors, to come up to me and very quietly put her hand on my um, arm and say, calm down, Brenda, because I would be upset. Calm down. Um, we want to live well. And if people needed to leave, which is a common conflict resolution strategy, and there's a community decision-making process. If there's conflict between parties in the community, there's some consensus built about who should leave. But the goal is to live well. And when people are mad, when there's discussion, when there's possibility of a fissioning event or something, people will say, I'm going to find a place to live well. And it turns out that the in in Brazil, the anthropologists and the linguists have done a lot of work with this concept. And it's deeply rooted in the Tupi-Guarani language family, which covers most of the continent. And there's a specific term that has a common root in all these different languages. And it is basically translated to find a place to live well. So people are cautious about violence. They're attentive to the potential for violence. They have strategies for avoiding violence, for considering the multiple responsibilities that are inherent in conflict, and one's own responsibility for addressing that as a responsible adult and member of a community. So I think the piece that we tend to lose sight of in these discussions is that larger context, and that, John's dissertation was called The Thoughtful Warrior. And I think that's really, totally embedded in that concept.
Hmm.
I can give you one of my favorite examples, and this was like really early. So in Copatasa, which was again the first community we went into, and it was on a different river. We took Don Brown's advice and went for a short period of time, which was almost 5 months, to learn how to live well in a community and learn what we needed to do for logistics and, try out some of the data methodologies and then come back home and sort of refine all of that and regroup. But so we went into Copatasa. And one of the first things that happened, and again, it was always so many things were just a big surprise to us, I think, when they were happening. But there was all this commotion, and the man who had loaned us a house, who was the senior man who had said we were looking for a place, because it was a time when we were dying. There were very few people left in the territory, but somehow someone had called a plane to go into multiple communities to collect 5 elder men, and they were going off to a little tiny place, and it was slowly revealed that there was a man who had been found dead in his house with blood everywhere, splattered all around the house. And these 5 elders were brought, by plane, coordinated among themselves to go in and evaluate the situation, determine what had happened, and determine what the appropriate response would be. Now, if this were a murder, which it, to the Western eye appeared to be, then it would obligate a response, a retaliatory, violent response by one thread of obligation, which was pretty dominant,
So
and
if it was a murder, so the norm is the murder must be avenged. Are there any exceptions to that rule, or is that always the rule? If they determine it's a murder, then it must be avenged. Is that how it works?
there are ways around it.
Okay.
So this is one of the things that I learned in this situation. But, if you think of it, again, in a place where institutionalized authorities don't exist, there are no police to call in, there are no
Hmm.
judges. Adults are the ones responsible for deciding how to address and adjudicate these kinds of violent actions. All societies have to make these decisions.
Hmm.
And they have institutionalized decision-making processes for doing that, and people who are responsible for implementing them. So, but sort of the story is that the 5 elders, one of whom was from the community where we were, Kopatasa, decided, we found out when they came back, decided that it was a phantasm. It was who had killed this man,
Hmm.
and that no retaliatory action was obligated or
Wow,
one.
I really want to dig into this. That is fascinating. So, who are these people who, and what were their connections to the person who was killed? These people who were deciding that this was a phantasm.
So I don't know, and I don't even know if I would have that in my notes because we were so new to the territory and the community at the time. I don't know if I know the relationship.
Hmm.
Um,
Do they usually have no relation? Are they
no,
sort
most
of?
people are related to each other.
So the people who are determining what to do next are people who are usually socially or genetically connected to the victim.
No,
No.
not necessarily. I mean, everybody in the territory, you have almost no business being there if you're not related by blood or marriage. So
Okay.
that's just the case.
Okay.
Um, and anthropologists understand this. We are always thrilled when we get our fictive kinship terms
Okay.
because that gives us a place in the community. So I'm grandmother.
Hmm.
John, on the other hand, was some monkey, a
Fictive kinship
bearded,
for those. Yeah.
a bearded monkey,
That's really
different kind
funny.
of fictive
That's really
kinship.
funny. That's really
Yeah.
funny.
So, but my sense of it was this was a man who was not closely related to a lot of other people, and my memory is that it was that he lived, and he must have had a family of some kind, but maybe just a wife and a mother-in-law or something like that. But I don't know for sure. But that he lived maybe even in an isolated house on the river
Hmm.
rather than in a larger household cluster or a larger community. But this is where status matters.
Hmm.
This is the definition of what makes an important person.
Hmm.
And an important person is someone that others listen to,
Hmm.
Mm.
right?
Okay.
So the men who went in were senior men from throughout the territory who were people that others listened to.
Hmm.
So they could confer among themselves. They were considered, knowledgeable and um, right-minded. And they reached that decision. And it was so clear to us, to John and I, that this was a decision to de-escalate. And
Hmm.
one of the strategies that people had in their toolkit that we had never read about or heard about or imagined, right? Just to declare that the death was due to supernatural means and a
Wow.
phantasm, so a being that wasn't
Hmm.
even sent by a shaman, which is a more common way to die.
Wow.
Um, so
That's really fascinating. So, am I correct in saying that it's not so much your social closeness or distance to the victim that determines whether you get to make this decision, but your status within the community and your political power? That it's the high status men who are primarily making the decision about whether to avenge someone's death or not. Is that correct?
I would say yes, that's correct. It's respected people, usually respected elders. It's not always men.
Hmm.
Um, and there too, I think there's so much that still remains to be written about the role that women play. So, the one who has the weapon in their hand, is not always the man, but probably more often the man than a woman. But women, for example, do a lot of divination and often determine who is responsible for a death that then leads to an avenge incident.
Hmm.
So, anyway,
So I really want to get into this phantasm thing because I find this really fascinating. So they attribute the cause of death to a ghost. Presumably, the reason they're doing this is because it's a socially acceptable way to say we don't want to avenge this person's death. We don't want to take on the risk of going into the neighboring community and finding who did it and risking our lives.
I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't
I
say that. Okay.
No, because these men had the right to respond
Hmm.
and the responsibility to respond. Someone would have had that right and responsibility to respond. And what it does is lead to more retaliatory violence, right? So
Hmm.
it's less about risk avoidance
Hmm.
than it is about conflict management.
Got it. So they're trying to avoid escalating the conflict and walking headfirst into a cycle of violence.
Right, or creating a new
Yeah.
type of
It's a,
Got
violence.
it's a
it.
judgment.
And so if that's their motive, we don't want to get into a cycle of violence where we're constantly avenging, an eye for an eye makes everyone blind. We don't That's our motive here. Um, why not just come out and say that? Why do we have to make up this story about the ghost?
So I just gave a talk at our national conference, and I've done versions of this talk for a while, but and it thinking about Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies and what constitutes valid evidence and what logics pertain are very culturally specific.
Hmm.
So, and the understanding of the world as it is, as a place where death is caused by certain things, people that the explanation of the phantasm fits into that native ontology, that understanding of the world and how
Hmm.
death comes about.
Hmm. So,
So
let me reframe the question. Do you see this phantasm story as a way of covering up the real motive, which is to avoid a cycle of violence, or do you view this belief that as sincere, that they truly believe that the person was killed by a ghost?
I think that they carefully considered the evidence at hand
Hmm.
and decided that the a reasonable explanation was the phantasm.
Hmm.
And whether they also considered the fact that this would quell violence, I would say, of course, you know,
Yeah.
and those men, that was of their generation, and knowing one of them, um, actually, and knowing of actually another one, knowing him,
Hmm.
that was their responsibility. So
Hmm.
they reached that decision, I would say, on balance after considering multiple um, possibilities. And I wasn't there. I don't know what kinds of evidence they considered, but certainly, just the blood all over the place was apparently consistent with the killing by a phantasm. And the fact that there seemed to be no obvious um, individuals who would be likely responsible for that death. Um, there was no blame of others that I heard. Now, there may have been those discussions in other communities, but people would have discussed a lot of different possibilities. But the one who pronounces the decision is generally the higher status person, usually as an outcome of hearing other perspectives and listening to other perspectives. So they gathered multiple people together to discuss it.
That thing you said about being listened to, I mean, one of the things, and that I remember John saying was that um, when you go to these meetings, there's all this posturing, especially often young men, strong men, and lots of things are said. But then at some point, somebody starts talking. It's a loud room, and then the room quiets down. And that's when you know that the person who is with high status is speaking. And it's not often somebody who's sort of superficially impressive for an outsider. If somebody just came off the plane or the canoe, they might not pick them out of the group as being the person who looks quote unquote like the leader. Um, and that really struck me, and still does. And I think, that thing you said about being listened to, and I think one of the things that uh, people listening also might think in hearing this, and obviously we're focusing on the violence because that's so different from what I mean, most of us were privileged to not be in that kind of context. And so that's the thing we're focusing on. And, I'm sure most of the day people are laughing and playing and eating and cooking and, doing things. We're focusing on that. I mean, I think appropriately enough, but also, as you said, we don't want to essentialize what the culture is like or life is like. But I think the other thing people might hear, especially is this thing of, especially with women being taken, is sort of women don't have agency. And I know, Brenda, you mentioned early on that you guys divided up living and dead, but also by gender, or by sex. And I think, some of the things John told me, he sort of relayed about that, he learned it from you, and you have such a long history in the community that, I think historically there's been a long, long overlooking of sort of women and women's roles and women's agency and how that plays out in this context. And I know you've thought a lot about that. Can you say something about that? I mean, I think you have I can't over um, uh, sell is the wrong word, but sort of overemphasize how much you have such a long, deep knowledge of this field site and such trust. And obviously, you don't have to betray any trust in terms of, like this will be a public thing. But yeah, please, can you just sort of, for those people listening who are sort of thinking, women's agency doesn't exist, and this is all about the men and the violence. Like, can you sort of how do you think about that? Yeah.
Well, I was interested in women's status when we first went in and women's relationships and now remembering this is 1992 and the anthropology of women was still a relatively new field. So um, most studies in anthropology of women's status had addressed women's status relative to men, and a lot of it was done from a Marxist perspective. So within, sort of the patriarchy. And and I and this was a good opportunity to do that, right? To look at women's status relative to men. But the first thing that we found when uh, starting those tasks, the triadic comparison tasks on status and alliance, was that men refused to comment on women's relationships. And they said it would cause trouble. But this was the way it was explained to me, is that, and when we were talking about, so we began to, investigate separately those concepts of women's status and alliance and did the tasks separately. But it was said that women lead among women and men lead among men. And that's true in a lot of societies where men and women have really distinctive domains of responsibility. And it's not all, home versus politics. So, but women are very active, and I've written about this some, but a fair amount. So men and women are very active in political decision making and consensus building, but women do converse among women, men converse among men. The difference is that women have access to men's spaces. I was interested in sort of domestic space. And so women have access to men's spaces during these big open discussions. Men do not have access to women's spaces. So women actually have more knowledge of what's going on. And this is where women can be and are effective in mediating disputes. They have more sometimes cross-coalitional alliances than men. And so they can cross those boundaries and help develop consensus about what appropriate mediation would be. I think you may know the story. Sometimes a woman will just march across, the boundary between the two factions in Conambo and walk into a house and basically tell the men that they're behaving badly. And here's what needs to happen, and that does happen. And this was one of my favorite stories because it was a dispute where this is the time when someone, when Isaac said, you can't kill me, I'm Achuar, I will kill you. And but these guys, it was a dispute over who was the father of a child. So there was some reproductive issue at stake and who was responsible among the young men. And it just turned into, and they'd been drinking because it was a big event. And the senior men, as I said, very undignified, got into a fist fight but the floor of the house fell. And now this is Conumbo behind me, so you can see that the floors of the houses are raised. So it broke through and all the men came crashing through. And that was the end of the fight, and everybody went home. And the next day, the dispute was resolved by one of the women. And it was so funny. I just laughed so much. And then the story was told to me on the phone because, since when we first went, that would have been impossible. But the woman actually lived in town, was from Conumbo, so I would get phone calls. Now I get like Facebook messages almost every day, or,
Yeah.
so anyway, but I'm not sure, I may have wandered off a little bit in that. But so women, and this is women are concerned about anything that has the potential for violence because it affects their lives too. And to
Hmm.
think that that domain would be left exclusively to men in these small communities where everybody visits every day and the daily work really is the management of politics, um, would just be lacking imagination,
Yeah.
Hmm.
understanding of how the world works. I don't. So women to agency is such a funny concept, right? Because we often tend to forget that agency specifically has to do with how one navigates one's life within a particular structure and of community or society or institution or whatever. But I have this phrase, politics afoot. You can see politics afoot. You can see when people are walking to somebody else's house and that it wouldn't be part of their daily routine, something's up. So it's just, I'll say we chose Conambo, which has and did and has had continuously about 200 people, just slightly under 200, because it was the largest community in the territory, and because it was divided into these two ethno-linguistic factions, and it was famous. I mean, we heard about it long before we were ever invited to go there. So it was a really good place to study coalitional dynamics. And where we could get a 100% sample, while many psychologists criticize the sample size. Tell me anyone who,
Yeah.
I mean, really would be unhappy with a 100% sample. Um, so that was, anyway, so I hope that helps.
Yeah, yeah. It was the
Yeah.
story that I think John told me about getting the guys drunk. Was that also something that actually came from you? That the is that the apocryphal, or did I get that right? That there were two men and they were sort of in conflict, and the wives sort of told the other, each of them independently, that the other had been sort of considering apologizing, but they had in fact just talked amongst each other, decided it was a good idea to have a resolution, and they just sort of put them in a hut together with some chicha, which is the alcoholic drink, and sort of
That happened.
the men quote unquote decided to um, uh, back off, yeah, the
That
conflict.
happened more than once.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's not uncommon. And I think for that particular story, I think John and I were both there,
Okay. Yeah.
and we did these daily rounds of houses, but we would sometimes be involved in different conversations because there is kind of a men's side of the house and a woman's side of the house.
Yeah.
And
But I
um,
like that. I like the kind of cryptic, or at least from a male-centric perspective, which has been the long default for anthropology and science, right? It looks cryptic, but I think it's a good example of. I mean, I think maybe this is too strong, but I think an argument against that is almost like the men are the drones and the women are controlling them, right? It's sort of like you don't get your hands dirty, um, you don't risk yourself, but you're really, that's a different way to look at the power dynamic and the cost and benefit logic.
Hmm.
And I think it's only because what John relayed to me when he expressed that was in the context of saying that you have such this long history of trust in the community. He mentioned another anecdote where somebody threatened him at some point, and John, I think, said, "I've known you since you were and he pointed to his knee or something, and that actually led to this person sort of backing off a bit. Like, I remember carrying you, basically, was what John said to this guy.
And I may not have been there for that one. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, no, I remember him telling me that. Yeah, he probably didn't. So yeah. But I think like that idea of sort of that quote unquote cryptic leadership, but that's only because it hasn't been viewed from this more quote unquote more objective perspective, which I think would be the argument that, the women are doing a lot, and it's by design that some of it looks cryptic from the perspective of the men.
Certainly, if we're talking about the existing literature in anthropology, I was remembering um, women, if you look at the old ethnographies, deserve their special category in the index because they're
Wow.
mentioned so infrequently.
Wow.
And there might be 3 pages
Wow.
where women are
Hmm.
mentioned
Yeah.
specifically. So
Interesting.
I really have deep concerns
Yeah.
about the current use of that literature
Yeah.
Hmm.
to call information about women given, and that literature has been so heavily critiqued, you know.
I mean, could it be that this underestimation of women's influence in these societies is itself a product of the subtlety and intelligence with which they influence people covertly? That is in fact a design feature that they are trying to influence without creating common knowledge that the influence has taken place.
I think that's a really important question. And I think that the anthropologists who went to the field, if they gave any credit to women, assumed that. But because they did not have access to, or even questions about women's participation in political decision making, there's so little written that we don't know. I really think
Yeah.
it's an area that's open for more study.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One of the themes, I think my job in this podcast is to say the themes every every episode at least once. But one of the themes in our discussions has often been humility and sort of appreciating, and just sort of listening to people who aren't usually listened to. And I think that this is a really good example of that. The understanding ourselves in the science. This is a really clear case of if people go in sort of arrogantly or not respecting the people or evolved psychology, and that there's going to be, what kids are doing, what women are doing, even if you're a male from a, 1950s, 60s anthropologist, if you're letting your culture's sort of bargaining power blind you to the scientific questions you're asking, you're not looking at what children are doing, what women are doing, it's bad for the science, right?
Mhm.
And, you know, because John and I did our field work initially during a time period when 12 months in the field was a minimum, and because we aspired to be deeply immersed in that ethnographic context, I think we learned a lot more. And so, there's discussion now about slow science and fast science, but also, it, I think that we understand that we're sometimes blinded by our questions, right? We go in with a particular question that's formulated, we collect our data to address that particular question, and we may never learn about these other phenomena if we're not there to ask questions about it. So the beauty of ethnography and the beauty of anthropology, especially long-term committed community-based anthropology, is that you learn what you may never have asked about, and if you
Mhm.
listen.
Yeah.
And that's to me the great privilege of being able to do this work is to is to is that, to learn things that you might never have have thought about.
Yeah.
um
Yeah. Yeah, as a psychologist being interested in coalitional psychology, I always think to myself, talking to John always kept me honest. And it was exactly for this reason, right? And I think psychology and the evolutionary behavioral sciences, I mean, David and I have talked about this. We've had many people who are right in the in between anthropology and psychology. And I think it's so important as psychologists, and I say this as a laboratory psychologist, to keep anthropology in the evolutionary behavioral sciences because it keeps us honest, and we really lose our reality tethering if we don't keep
Mhm.
talking to and ultimately it's being grounded in the local knowledge and what's actually happening. Yeah.
Yeah, and I understand that next year HBES and the Cultural Evolutionary Society are going to hold joint meetings, and I think
Yeah.
a really
Yeah.
positive
Yeah.
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Speaking of interfactional conflict, I'm glad that the factions are being united in evolutionary social science. Um, I want to, speaking of factions, I want to return to something you mentioned about women having more social ties between the rival factions than men had, and that because of that, women were sort of trusted more as impartial mediators and adjudicators of intra or intergroup conflict. And I find that to be a really interesting gender divide. And I'm kind of curious about how that divide came to be, why you think it exists, and how women are navigating that role.
And I'm not sure that it's so much that they're like trusted more, but rather that
Hmm.
they have greater access, right? Because
Hmm.
they formed these relationships that
Got it.
cause
So they just have more
coalition.
knowledge about the situation itself in these conflicts.
Often that's
Okay.
true. And I talked to Lita about this when during the symposium for
Hmm.
John in October, but John and I collected data over many years, and our goal for this time of our lives was to look longitudinally at men's and women's coalitional structures. And that scenario that I just described really relates to um, two time periods. And contrary to my expectations, the women with the greater cross coalitional ties um, were those with fewer kin within their own coalition and across the
Hmm.
coalition. And so my argument was they needed to establish those cross coalitional ties because that gave them really a place to go in the event that they lost their place in their own coalition,
Hmm.
which again, conflict resolution often involves someone leaving and they being less securely related by kinship to people in their own coalition would be the most likely to have to leave if there were some kind of conflict. And that did happen
Hmm.
with a couple of women and their families. But so what I wanted to see, so basically the structures looked like men had these really cleanly bounded coalitions. And they needed to be really clear on where their alliances were. And I
And
mean,
Brenda, to just interrupt, is that the linguist? Is that the like, color, where there's that one hut that's over? What can you just explain? So just so people have a sense of what is the scale of the coalition for the men? Yeah.
right. So, um, and this really was, John's methodology to collect quantitative information using cognitive anthropological approaches to reconstruct really the political landscape, the categories of alliances. So men and the whole community really talked about Conambo being divided upriver and downriver
Mm.
into Achuar and Quechua factions. And that was true, even though each of those factions, in fact, was ethnically mixed. Okay,
Mm,
so by marriage and political affiliation, and the one house that so we have this kind of iconic figure of, sort of this line, this wavy line that represents the river, and then houses distributed along the river, and you can see that upriver, I think they're coded, I can't remember if it's red or blue. Yeah, you have the
I think
mud.
I'm looking around. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
somewhere in my office here.
Oh,
Yeah.
but you can see how clean the divide is. And the
mm,
divide that in that image is based on two things. It's based on how people discuss, right? How people refer to themselves and how they refer to others. And it was the theory of ethnicity and identity is that it's situational, right? So you may refer to yourself differently in different situations. So one way that it was explained to me by a woman is, I am with the Achuar, but
mm,
I am Quechua. So if that helps
mm.
clarify.
That that actually just raises more questions. So
Right,
so
right.
there's a distinction between um, being one of a member of the group and being with the group. So what is the difference there? Because they sound the same to my Western ear. So could you unpack that distinction?
I can tell you how that is viewed. Yeah, when people talk about, it's usually based on identity. If we're talking about, let's say, ethno-linguistic identity,
Hmm.
then people identify usually based on the language that they spoke in the home. Okay, their
Mm,
first language. Now, if their parents spoke different languages and multiple languages, then there's a little bit of complication there in how clean that pattern is. But generally, when people talk about the first language that they learned, the foods they eat, um, kind of how, how fierce they are, those kinds of characteristics that are ascribed to ethno-linguistic groups and that are learned during early socialization. Um, I, I mean, that is more of what can be called an ethno-linguistic dimension of identity,
mhm,
right? And then, but the political factional affiliation on
mm,
the ground, even though people refer to the upriver people as Achuar and the downriver people as Quechua, though now they refer to them as Zapata, which is a whole nother dimension of things, but um, it's it's a gloss.
mhm,
And it generally refers to who the founders of those places were.
mhm,
So the upriver faction, the founders of that household cluster were Achuar people, and then others joined them.
mhm,
And the same downriver, the founders were identified at the time as Quechua, and then others joined them.
mm,
So they're known as the Achuar above and the Quechua down below. And this is just really classic identity. It conforms with classic identity theory, right? That theory of that identity is multidimensional and that it's
yes,
situational.
yes.
So the lovely thing about field work, especially in the long term, is that you see theory come to life, and that really does in Konobo. So, but it's hard for people to understand that
Yeah.
sometimes,
Yeah. And I
Yes.
know
I mean,
oh,
but
sorry,
we
David.
know it.
Yeah.
yeah. I
Um,
mean, I just I'm very excited to hear you talk in these terms because I do work in political psychology, and I think a problematic tendency is to over-explain political beliefs and political activity in terms of identity, as opposed to allegiance. So these are two different things, and I applaud you for highlighting the important distinction between these things. I think that political psychologists too often get caught up in identity and miss out on alliances. So, for example, I don't have to be a police officer to feel political allegiance to police officers if I'm a Republican. I don't have to be a black person to feel as though I'm an ally of black people politically. Um, and if we focus solely on identity, which group you strictly belong to, rather than allegiances and loyalties, we're missing out on the crucial dimension of what politics is and how it works. So I'm going to go out on a limb and wager that the I am with this group is going to matter more politically than the I am a member of this group. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I looking at material culture, looked at pottery and pottery design, and I've looked in considerable depth, but from the perspective of um, design as ethnic marker. And one of the things, and really I have to give credit to John for this because women make this beautiful elaborate pottery, and I was collecting pottery and I was going to analyze it to see whether their political affiliation or political identity was reflected more strongly in their designs than their ethno-linguistic identity,
Mm,
really to test this idea that, well, pottery is supposed to reflect ethnicity and it's supposed to be, unchanging virtually, and which didn't work out. So, because it really fits better. So John said, well, then why don't you just ask women if they can identify the ethnicity of the woman who made the pot based on
Hmm.
just showing them the pots. So I did
mhm.
that test too. And and women, it fits all the characteristics of ethnic markers that we would expect with stereotyping. And women certainly were more accurate at identifying what was not made by a woman of their group than at identifying what was, because they made finer gradations of otherness. And but to your question, um, both the design similarities and the women's identification of the pottery um, was predicted significantly more by their political affiliation than by their ethno-linguistic identity. So
Wow.
my argument is that they're, signifying in group and out-group identity very actively in the pottery designs that they're making, which explains really the cultural transmission of the design.
Wow. So the pottery is not uh, necessarily signaling which group I belong to, but which group I am politically loyal to.
Right. If by which group I belong to, you mean the ethno-linguistic identity.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So it's not something that is, static and
Mm,
passive and, learned in early socialization and perpetuated throughout the lifetime of an individual, but that these markers are being used actively to signify and to be understood as markers of in-group, out-group identity in a political sense. Yeah.
It's
that's
so, yeah, it's so
fascinating. I mean,
interesting.
I'm sorry, I just have to delve deeper into this because I find this so fascinating. So, the pottery is being used as a signal of which faction you are loyal to. That if you're trying to predict pottery, um, loyalty is the right variable to look at. So, I'm very curious about what it is about pottery that makes it a good way of signaling or signifying political differences, and why other methods aren't used. Why can't they just be out in the open? I'm loyal to this side. I'm loyal to this side. Why do they have to communicate this information through pottery?
There are many markers of affiliation, and
Uh-huh.
they're all the time.
Yeah.
So it may be who you invite to your house for
hmm
um, a work party, to whom you give meat.
hmm
That's why it's hard to, and whether it's all understood as signification, I think probably so. Whether it's all done for purposes of signification, I think probably not. I
Hmm.
think so.
So if not signification, then what would the alternative motive be?
Well, um, so we studied relationships in a lot of different ways.
Hmm.
We studied meat sharing. We
Hmm.
studied the um, sharing of propagules, garden propagules, and how that relates to garden richness and
Hmm.
women's reproductive success. Um, the meat sharing is certainly, if you look at the pattern, signifies alliances, but you also get the pattern where higher status men are giving more meat than they're receiving, and they in again, it all relates to reproductive success and strategies of alliance building. I mean,
Hmm.
strategies of alliance building and status building as a um,
Hmm. Yeah. So it's not merely a signifying alliance, but also a status marker as well.
uh, in what terms?
And so you're talking about meat sharing in particular is both a way of signifying status, but also a way of forging alliances. Is that right? And is something similar going on with pottery, or
That's this is where I think we're too focused, not in this conversation, but in general in the field,
Mhm,
maybe more focused on status as a goal rather
mhm,
than kind of almost a byproduct. But so I think building coalitions is more important than building status.
mm,
But people who are best at building coalitions accrue status because of the skills that they have in coalition building. And they become known for um, making wise decisions, speaking well, and the things that give people status.
mm,
So, meat sharing, I, I think it would be really hard to say people share meat and give more meat for to build status, even though it
okay,
accrue. Partly, it's not highly visible, so
okay,
it's more of a dyadic relationship. Um, sending, I mean, for me to go, John and I to go back to our house and find a leg of deer slapped onto the table with someone writing in charcoal from the fire, from Basilio, Mukushiwa or something, is not uncommon. But so I don't see all those things as markers, if that's what, as signification of status or status striving, but rather as coalition building.
mm,
And I think that's more important. And
got
it's
it.
more important to the well-being of people's families, which translates into reproductive success. And
Right. So I mean, the question then in my mind is what in fact is the difference between status and coalitional support? Is there do you see a distinction there? Are they the same thing or are they different? What is the relationship between them? So for me, in this conversation, they're sort of blurry, the difference between these two things. In my mind, the way I think about status is is basically in terms of coalitional support. So my way of thinking about status, you can feel free to disagree with this way, is common knowledge of a person's relative value as a social partner, and its downstream consequences on coalitions and alliances. So it is a good strategy to favor the high value partners as allies and coalition members. And because it is a good strategy to do that, people who are recognized as valuable partners, therefore, as a byproduct, acquire all this political power because they have all these people who are willing to support them and be their allies. So I view status as basically what happens when a community gains common knowledge that say I'm the best, and that causes everyone to want to be my ally. And as we say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if I hate someone, People are going to show support to me by hating that person. If I love someone, they're going to show support to me by loving that person. If I take a side, they're going to try to be on my side. They're going to try to imitate me, to show loyalty to me. I view all of that as a kind of status. So, what do you think of that way of thinking? Do you have a different way of thinking? Um,
Fine. And I think I'm going to go back to the
yeah,
pottery
yeah,
and tell you that there's this category that I created of women
hmm
in
yeah,
data that I could see over and over again that I call women in between, and they're the women who politically mediate. They also paint pottery that women can't identify as either Achwa or Quechua. They have ambiguous pottery, but they recognize the styles of both above and below. And I argue that that's an intentional strategy,
mm,
political ambiguity. But I
mm,
think of status as influence, and I think of status as influence that is wielded in the process of political decision making, um, within, and it has to be embedded within a coalition.
hmm
It's not
yes,
something that exists independently,
hmm
as a personal characteristic that one carries around with them wherever they go.
yeah,
So I don't think that's inconsistent with what you're talking about, but I don't think that it is the consensus that's built isn't necessarily a single kind of consensus. It's really that individual people all tend to consider this person in that way. But status is, and again, this is the methodology that we used, right? So
hmm
we, spent a fair amount of time doing kind of what are called free listing exercises where you just ask people, what is it that makes an important person? And they free list those attributes and you find some consensus, and then those become attributes of study. But and you elicit in this context the indigenous terminology for people of status, of importance, what because status is a meaningless term,
hmm
in most contexts. But so and in so I can tell you what those terms are, but in Quechua, it's an amu, which really translates best into organizer rather than
hmm
leader. Someone who can organize a new community, someone who starts a new community, invites others to join, someone who can organize a fish poisoning event, someone who, when they invite people, they come, someone who, when
hmm
they speak, they're listened to,
hmm
someone who, when they loan something, they get it back. I mean, they're really interesting
yeah,
attributes ascribed to a person of status. And so in Quechua, it's Amu, which best translates into organizer. And and then in Achwar, I love it. It's Hun, which means big. And
mm,
Hunri are the big people, and it's not just men.
mm,
It's women and men. If you ask people who the Hunri are, they'll list men and women. Men more often leave out the women, but not everyone, and certainly not the women. So they're people of influence and respect, and I think in measured in many ways that I think are universally true.
mm,
Um, and then, but they are, Hunri or Amu within that context. And they actively work as responsible people to give meat to people who might not otherwise have it, which is part of how they extend those um, coalitional ties. But
mm,
it's women who don't have a husband, a new family who doesn't have a lot of other relationships, um, the visiting anthropologists. You know, who do you give meat to? And usually you can give more meat because you're a better hunter. I mean, there are lots of
Right.
implications all bound up in that.
Yeah.
Um, people people respect people who work hard. You know,
Yeah.
women have big gardens. There's a relationship between garden richness and women's political centrality and their reproductive success. Um,
Mhm.
so even though you tend to think sometimes there's not a lot of variation in women's reproductive success, there is, and it's very meaningful. So I'm not sure. I just, it's, I think you just can't see status as disembedded from coalition. And I don't think
Got it.
that everybody's out there status driving. I
Got
think
it.
status is something that's built by this sense of responsibility for others and
Got it.
sense of responsibility for conflict resolution, especially in this context. Um,
Because, yeah.
there's the theory, there's political factionalism, the theories of the work done in political factionalism um, a while ago really is helpful, I think, in that respect, because it really gives you an idea of the importance of the swing voters, which is certainly important in politics today,
Hmm.
and how people curry the alliance of those swing voters, and that certainly happens in this context as well. And I think that that's probably universally true in
Hmm.
politics, that you have people that may defect, or maybe you can get to defect, and those people tend to get sometimes a little more attention than perhaps they deserve, but you need them.
Interesting. So you don't view status as separable from coalitional support or political power, that they're basically the same thing.
I don't think they're the same thing. I think they're
Okay.
two different dimensions
Okay.
of relationships. Um, So you can have someone with a really strong coalitional base who doesn't have a lot of status, but
Hmm.
people will,
That's odd.
support them.
That's interesting. So how would that work? A person who is um, say has a lot of influence, coalitional support, political power, whatever you want to call it, and yet they're low status. How does that work?
Well, especially in these kinds of communities, status, is partly a factor of age.
Okay.
So you may have a young man who's very hardworking, whose status may be a little higher than expected for his age, but it's still low in the community overall. But if he's well respected and perhaps, hardworking and shares a lot of his resources with others, demonstrates his commitment to being a good member of the community and the coalition, supports for young men his father-in-law
Hmm.
when expected to do so. Then if there is a conflict, then he's more likely to be supported in that conflict by others who do not have those same attributes. So in this study, the question was for status, what makes an important person?
Hmm.
And those are the attributes that I described. And then the question about alliance was who would support who in the event there were a conflict involving these three people. And so
Hmm.
that was the triadic task for alliance.
And were these related? So were the important people also the people who would be supported in conflicts, or were they often different people?
Yeah, they're related. So I wish I had a graph.
Hmm.
So there's a we have some really nice diagrams of sort of coalitional relationships, the
Hmm.
political landscape with the icons for each individual scaled by size according to status. So you can see that the higher status people are most well situated within their alliances. And even for men, the highest status people tend to be more toward the center of the division between the two coalitions. For women, it's really clear. There are almost three groups. So you have like the Achwara Alliance, the Quechua Alliance, and then this group, loose group, but still statistically significant, where women who have higher status than expected for their age are more centrally located between the two coalitions. So it's really a nice visual representation of their position as mediators within
Hmm.
the coalitions.
Okay.
So it's almost like status is the filler for sort of how we have to get by and make a living in whatever context we are. And in particular in Kanambo, that is, you know, having coalitional influence or influence in the community. Like yeah.
I think you can't disentangle them. And, if we want to read contemporary social theory, Bourdieu would tell us that in a heartbeat, but that status comes from one's position within those, in this case, what we call alliances or coalitions. And
Right. It's a relational attribute. It's not a noun. It's not a thing. It's sort of it's like being good at, like if I just said somebody's good at something, it doesn't tell you what they're good at, right? Like it doesn't fill in the content. It's just sort of an adjectival word, right? It's
and
sort of
and
like
that's a
status is sort of like what that is. That it's
yeah,
status has that same status has the
Hmm.
same status, which is
and that's a
unhelpful.
Interesting.
Yeah.
that's a really good way to think about it. And I think
Hmm.
about this with the shamanism too, where people are looking for the shaman, but
Right.
shamanic power or ability is often relational, right? And it's not a role. It's something that you cultivate and you have more or less of
Mm.
and than others. So yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
it's so interesting. I mean, this is again, I can think where this is real time keeping us honest here. Like we're learning about status. Yeah.
Yes. We're both interested in this topic, and as we've been uh, seeing, it's just an incredibly rich and complicated topic with lots of really subtle distinctions to be made. I remember we got into status a lot with Chris Van Ruden, who we had on the podcast, and he told a story that stuck with me of a hunter who was exiled from the community for being too good of a hunter, for being a show off,
Huh.
and that often being too overt or braggadocious in one's seeking of status or influence could actually lower your status and influence. And I'm curious if there are similar dynamics at play in the communities that you've worked with.
And anthropologists have a term for that called leveling mechanisms that are
Hmm.
commonly found in small scale societies. But let me think. Um, I can't think of any circumstances that would fit that
Hmm.
scenario. Um, Men, especially young men, tend to be fairly humble,
Hmm.
and they need to be.
Hmm.
Um, so I can I guess I can see how that happens. But so this territory and this region, indigenous communities, is predominantly matrilocal, meaning that young men to be married need to go and live in the house of their father-in-law and mother-in-law. And there is a period of bride service where they're really obligated to work, to do whatever it is that especially their father-in-law wants them to do. So to tell someone to take a 2-day hike to go buy a cigarette at a military base for a party that's coming up might be a task that you would assign to a son-in-law. In the old days, it could be a several-month trip downriver to get salt. And those are tasks for young married-in sons-in-law. So I imagine that if a young man were a little too cocky in the house of his father-in-law, he would be
Mm-mm.
sent on an even longer trip. But I don't really, young men certainly express that they need to behave in a certain way while they're married in, um, especially at first. So I can't, there are people who are sort of men who may be kind of a bully, an older,
Hmm.
a higher status senior man. And what I see is that he's had a hard time finding husbands for his daughters because they don't want to go live with him, and people don't want them to go, their sons to go live there. But I
Mm.
don't, so, but I can't think of anything that is really overtly kind of a leveling mechanism that I've observed, and mostly because I can't think of a single example of behavior I've seen that would be categorized as braggadocious.
Mm.
I
It,
think
it,
there's teasing and those.
Interesting. Is it because if it were to happen, it would be penalized and therefore it doesn't happen? Or is the idea of braggadociousness being bad not even a thing?
People make fun of people sometimes,
Hmm.
which, but it's not as an outcome of that, I think. I don't know. I can't
Hmm.
answer the question. I
Yeah.
don't, I can't really think of anything that
Yeah.
um
I mean, certainly
like
the
that.
father who's having a hard time finding husbands for his daughters because he's perceived to be a bully, that is a real Darwinian reproductive consequence for being seen as a bully. And you would expect that to matter a lot if your reputation is uh, that poor. So that certainly to me suggests at least some real costs being faced for being seen as too much of a bully. But yeah, no, it's interesting because I have a way of thinking about this that basically tries to explain the variation in status symbols as deriving from the fact that revealing them as status symbols often negates their status enhancing effects. And so that creates a kind of volatility in status seeking, such that if it all comes out in the open that we're just a bunch of braggadocious status seekers, then we all have to do something different to show that we're more humble or that we don't care about status, and that creates an incentive to send a different signal. And this creates a dynamic that would cause cultural variation in the types of status signals being sent over time. Does that sound plausible to you?
Yeah, I think that to consider that more, I would think about um, what might be contexts for status striving that
Hmm.
are novel contexts,
Hmm.
and who moves into those positions, and that um, and then and of course that's happening now, because the men who were, you know, the ones at my knee when we first went in are now president of the Indigenous political organization and that sort of thing. Um, and I think in those contexts would probably see some status leveling. And I haven't thought about that a lot. And I haven't, um, I don't, so and again, anthropologically, we know that when kind of new opportunities, new contexts for status open up, it's often the young men who strive to move into them because it gets them out from under the thumb of the elders who otherwise sort of keep their status under
Mhm.
control. So I
Mhm.
think probably, in Konamo now, and in a lot of other traditional societies where there's greater articulation with outside institutions, with NGOs and the coolness of indigeneity and such, that we might see more of that at play,
Mhm.
Yeah. Brenda, we've asked anthropologists sort of what it's like on a personal level being in these communities. And I mean, we've talked a lot about the violence, but there's also this principle of life that there's no free lunch, or for every con, there's a benefit, for every pro, there's a con, and vice versa. Is there anything about, like, when you experience sort of switching cultures, and you've been so immersed, and maybe the blinds are blurred, maybe, but that's sort of unique, or that's a pro, because there's all of this conflict, there's actually something else, there's almost like a piece, because everybody is sort of pretty coordinated about social relationships, where everybody's really close. People talk about closeness when they've been in conflict or combat together. Do you find that there are things that, for those of us who aren't in a culture where there is this sort of interpersonal violence, that they're sort of part of our evolved psychology, or part of our experience of social ties, that 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 you have, or Kanambo has, that you've seen people have, or that you have yourself, that what you see, that we wouldn't, David and I just would not have that experience? Is there anything like that?
I think I, yeah, I tend to see politics afoot everywhere.
Mm.
I see coalitions forming everywhere. I see people who are better or worse at it, certainly within faculty, within the academic senate, even within the administration. There are ways to um, observe coalitions that are forming that may require a little concern, or ways to understand coalitions and how they are formed on the ground to be effective at getting things done.
Mm.
Um, I think understanding that, I think politics and coalitional formation and respect and status formation are always part of the human condition, and recognizing that that's true in whatever context we're embedded. I think I see that. But and I think and I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but I feel like when I step into an Indigenous context, I understand better. And that's true in there are, and people who write in Native studies and um, really identify common characteristics of, really, we are talking about epistemology and ontology, and just an understanding of how the world works and the relationships and how important they are. I feel like I get that better than if I wouldn't have had this
Yeah.
experience.
Do you think that's because, I mean, maybe these are not mutually exclusive, but there's the one version where sort of like, everyone in a modern, I don't know what the right adjective is, but in a weird society, um, we're all just sort of like really poorly developed politically and coalitionally, because we don't have these like evolutionarily valid training life experiences? So is it that everybody, it's sort of like the hunting, like Chris talked about how, people are just really good, or everyone we've had on, you're good at identifying plants, you're a good hunter, you just have this, you're healthy, you have this great knowledge base. And, and we are all, David and I especially, we're just like bumbling idiots. So there's that. So one version is you get it when you show up because you have been trained in a crucible of sort of really, you've gotten good training in like actually ecologically or evolutionarily valid alliance and politics. Or is it that it's just that the cues for our evolved psychologies, it's just fitting the cue structure better, where it's just you're hearing the conversations, you're seeing the people, and maybe the same appetite that people have for sort of, TV shows or dramas or fiction is this appetite for, that's politics for our evolved psychology, not current politics of, abstract thing. So do you think, so this experience that you understand it again, maybe these are not separable. I mean, it's a hard question, but do you get a sense that it's because your evolved psychology is responding to that this is just the right cue structure for all of us? Or is it that the people you're working with are also just like really good at it because they have this face to face, like they're just really good at it and we're just really bad at it? Or maybe, and again, yeah.
I don't think we are really bad at it. I think we're really
Okay.
good at it. I think
Okay.
that evolved psychology is part of the way we all perceive the world. I think that I perceive it more acutely because of, and I imagine that you do, both of you also, because you've thought about the theory of it,
Mm,
the principles and the paradigm, and you'll recognize the patterns and the behaviors more rapidly and more consciously than others. But we all know movers and shakers, and it's context dependent, I think. So it may be, again, the academic senate, it may be the people who can move the conversation in a faculty meeting effectively, it may be making sure, or organizing the joint conference of HBES and the Cultural Evolutionary Society. Those folks are, embedded
yeah.
in structure of alliances, and maybe there's a little more status driving going on in our, modern world than there is in a small community. But I don't think anyone would deny that there isn't status driving going on, everywhere, and coalitions being formed everywhere. And I think the same principles apply,
Yeah.
just
One,
we're
one,
not hunting and giving meat. It's
yeah.
just different behaviors.
One of the things that really struck me in the October symposium was so many people came up and just talked about how you and John had opened sort of your house and your home and your family up to them. And I'm wondering, is that sort of the flip side of you going to Canambo, in the sense of, I mean, the dividing line between work and home, or home life or family life, um, you know, how do you, I don't even know what my question is, but I think, like it's just the observation that I was really struck with how many students felt like you adopted them and really took care of them. Is that something that you did consciously?
Well, kind of, but it wasn't unusual to find that one of us independently had invited somebody to come, and stay. But I think, honestly, I think it's who we both, John and I, are or were. In our homes when we grew up, we often had lots of other people, coming in and living with us for periods of time. And, it might be in my case, somebody who got thrown out of the house by their mother, and my mother would say, well, they can stay here, and they'd talk to the parents and say, they'll be okay, and we'll make sure, and a year later they're still there,
Yeah.
so I mean that was part of my growing up. And then John comes from a really big extended Mexican family, and so to have cousins and aunts, and his mother's sister lived with them almost his entire life. And so, so I think, and I don't know, maybe I've not had this conversation with a therapist, but maybe they would say we don't have good boundaries. But I think it's maybe that pre-adapted us to field work,
Right.
because there are boundaries, you have to learn them, but they're really different. And even proxemics are different, and what is your business versus somebody else's business, especially us, because there had to be a whole new category of person established for us. So boundaries were, we learned about them because we kind of needed to. But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
yeah,
think that's the anthropology is exactly sitting is the science of those boundaries, right? And sort of maybe just sitting right on them or pushing through them, right? Yeah.
yeah. And that was my, for finding a place to do research and maintaining that research site, living well within the community and contributing a benefit to the community, um, and understanding that you're there. I'm not even sure I would say as a guest, but you're there by virtue, you're hosted, you're
Yeah.
there, especially in an indigenous territory where we're totally dependent on people's permission
Yeah.
to be here. So
Yeah. It's
yeah,
by their grace, sort of in a way. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think
One of the things we ask people is if there's anything we should ask you, because we often don't even know enough to ask the right questions. Is there anything that, yeah, at whatever level that we should have asked?
don't don't think so. Um, I think, for students and others who are thinking about establishing a field site, I think recognizing how much time it can take to do that and how important getting permissions and building relationships is before you can even go into a community. So we were about 11 months in before we actually started our field work in Conumbo. So the IRB is a really great process because it requires you now to think about what your potential impacts on a community may be. And we do have impacts on a community when we go in. It just changes a lot for people. We become, kind of, we need to think about that, and we need to think about what kind of benefit we can return and how we can return a benefit in a way that allows people the choice to participate or not participate in the research. So we basically served as health promoters and the first aid station, and facilitated that access to medical care that people, when asked, that's what they wanted, and we could do that. And a lot of UCSB folks have done that. That was a model that we followed. Um, John could give injections and do little sutures because he'd worked in a medical research lab, and
Hmm.
and those were and he had worked in a venom lab, so and he could fix things like radios. So when there was a snake bite and the radio was down, he could gauge, and we had brought in anti-venom. And so in so he fixed the radio
Yeah.
and and then so we could call the pilots in for the emergency evacuation and could gauge the point at which it might be necessary to administer anti-venom, which you don't want to do if you don't have to because of the necrosis that can result. Anyway, there's so many things, right? So many things. Ask people what they need. That's, I think, the advice. Make sure you ask permission before you go anywhere. Don't take a lot of photographs. Don't be rude. Um, you know,
Good life lessons for any context,
Right,
actually.
Yeah.
right. And
Yeah.
we basically didn't go anywhere unless we were invited. We
Mm.
waited for invitations, and I find that to be good method.
Yeah.
So
How long has it been? So from the moment you stepped foot in Kanambo till this day, how many years is that, if you don't mind me asking? I'm just curious.
no, we first went in 1992 and maybe around April, somewhere around there. We went in first, and then that was part of our checking out different places and then going back to the States and regrouping and
Yeah.
coming back. So we landed in Conambo Christmas Eve, 1992, with a 2-year-old. And
Wow.
so that's been a few years,
Yeah.
right? Eight,
32, 32,
25,
something like
yeah,
that.
32, 33,
Yeah.
something like that.
And the if you were going to graph sort of how much knowledge people feel giving you, or sort of how much you know about the community, is it that even in the last 10 years you've learned so much more, or is it trailing off, or what's the curve of um
I haven't been back since John and I did our last field trip there in 2018, and then came COVID and
right, yeah, a lot of almost every anthropologist we've talked to has had the COVID line. Yeah.
yeah. So it's time to
Yeah.
go back. And it's not that I haven't been in touch with people. Like I said, I get phone calls and I get lots of Facebook messages. But so in that sense, I mean, the world of people in Conambo has changed so much. The younger generation speaks Spanish, they're literate. We just saw the first kid born in Conambo get her college degree.
Oh, cool.
And so just there's a lot of changes. But I think honestly, I mean, John and I started doing what we call tag team fieldwork and tag team parenting, and we did a lot of separate trips because somebody had the kids
Right.
back
Yeah.
as that stuff. But and I learned a lot. I think of them as pajama parties, just traveling with women and getting a big hotel room or staying on the river and a shelter that is built, for the night. But just, I think I learn stuff all the time. Every time I go, I learn something new. And so the
Yeah.
individual stories, but there's tons of data to be analyzed. So there's still work to be
Yeah.
done. And I got to go back this summer and even touch base and make
Yeah.
sure I'm getting, when are you coming? Are you coming back?
Yeah.
All the time. So
Yeah.
it's time. I have responsibilities and people that I care about. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's such an incredible, I mean, I think we're all lucky in the evolutionary behavioral sciences to be doing it. I feel that way. Um, and I especially think that, the anthropology part of that is it's just an incredible, these societies are changing so much, and to be the generation that sort of is seeing it, it's vanishing, right? These different places that are not all homogeneous. It's such a just an incredible opportunity to sort of document this way of living and these people.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the one hand, I feel like I have some responsibility to say we don't want to contribute to the myth of the vanishing.
No, exactly. Yeah. And I was
Mm.
even in my hemming and hawing, I was sort of
Yeah.
thinking about saying that. Yeah, exactly.
And that these, sort of
Yeah.
principles of indigeneity are found in urban Indian
Yeah.
communities. And, my students on campus who are Native, there's just a way of thinking about the world that is shared and I don't have to declare that as my own insight. We can
Right.
look at lots of writing by Native scholars and find it there. So I don't, I'm, I'm worried though about going back. So many people, including John, have died.
Yeah.
There will be observations of all those deaths, and there, um, I don't know what this next generation is going to be. That generation, though, there are boisterous ones, I mean, I think always, but it's when we talked, we used to talk about, sorry, UCSB this way when we were graduate students, and there were sort of the golden handshake given to a bunch of, or offered to a bunch of faculty who retired, and then suddenly the ones who had been the junior roosters became the senior roosters, and there was a lot of cockfight. And
Mm.
so I think that that's probably going on right now in Konabo to a certain extent. I and that would be interesting to see actually those leveling mechanisms and what the elders are doing, but they're probably just letting them do it, because
Yeah.
that's more typical. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Things are changing for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Brenda, for giving your insightful theoretical perspective, but more importantly, the rich empirical reality that our theories will inevitably collide with as we embark on this mission to try to understand uh, who we are. Uh, it was a real pleasure talking with you, and I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, and I will butcher this, but you and John both are Hundri and Amu. Yes, so both big and organizers. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to reflect on all of this and engage with those ideas. I think all these theories are compatible. So I think we're on the right track for sure. Anyway,
Mhm.
so thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So David, we've completed another episode.
We sure did. So, what can people do if they're enjoying what they're hearing and they want to support us and give us some encouragement?
They can share our episodes on social media. They can give us a rating on whatever format they listen to. They can also leave a positive review.
Yeah, all those would be great. And we also have a Patreon page if you're so inclined to support us.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess we'll see you next week then.